Rainworld's lore is complex and convoluted, and leaves plenty of room for anyone to misunderstand or misinterpret certain details. There are many quite major pieces of lore that have become widely misunderstood within the community. What was the original purpose of the Iterators? Was the most likely origin of the Slugcats? Unless you eat, sleep, and breathe Rainworld lore, and treat the Pearl dialogue as your own personal Bible, there's a good chance that your answers to these questions aren't quite right. They, along with other topics, are particularly prone to misconceptions. This is why, a few weeks ago, I ran a poll on my community page asking a couple of Rainworld lore questions on important topics that are commonly misunderstood. In this video, I'm going to break down each of these topics, their common misconceptions, and the results of the poll, to hopefully clear up some common misunderstandings or misinterpretations. If you didn't get a chance to participate in the poll, you can still play along in the video. I'll display all of the answer options and their percentages, only revealing the correct answer at the end of each section. I'm willing to bet that you'll learn something new from this video. All I ask is that you approach it with an open mind. I bring up the origin of the Slugcats primarily because of the number of comments I got about them in my older, outdated Ancients video. Most people seem convinced that they were purposed as pipe cleaners, although the community perception may have shifted slightly since then. This idea arises from the bright magenta shoreline pearl, which contains the genome of a purposed organism, described by Moon as a small slug to clean the inside of pipes. Of course, we are called the Slugcat, and a lot of our traveling does involve crawling through various pipes, so surely this pearl is referring to us, right? Well, it's not so simple. Consider the part where Moon specifically elaborates on us, stating that it's highly likely that we're the descendant of a purposed organism. The term descendant is very important, because this would imply that, at most, our distant ancestors were the ones manufactured for a specific purpose, not necessarily us. It's unlikely that the Slugcats, as we know them now, even existed before the Iterators' creators departed. In fact, it's entirely possible that this is the case for most creatures in Rainworld. With a few exceptions, like lizards, every creature may very well be the descendants of purposed organisms. The ecosystem, flora, and fauna likely gradually changed after their creators' departure. It's unlikely that the ancients or benefactors would recognize most of the animals that exist now. It is also important to note that despite Moon looking at the genome for a slug-like organism in her hands, right in front of you, she still doesn't directly liken it to us. That is, that we are the descendant of a purposed organism, but not this pipe-cleaning purposed organism specifically. We should also keep in mind that Slugcats are never actually called Slugcats in-game. It's more of a community nickname. Canonically speaking, they don't even seem to be very slug-like. Even including downpour dialogue, they're described as being more rodent-like. That, or we're described more as a creature or beast. If we were actually a manufactured creature, you would think that the Echoes or Iterators would recognize us. If you wanted to consider external sources, or the so-called Word of God, one of the original developers, Joar, seemed quite adamant in making this distinction, explaining that the slug aspect of them was invented by the community. I also think it's worth noting that it seems as both Joar and James originally intended to keep the exact biology of the Slugcat obscure. It probably wasn't designed with slugs or cats in mind at all. Believe it or not, but in the early stages of the game's development, they were actually called bears. With all this in mind, I think it is exceedingly unlikely that this slug pipe cleaner organism refers to us, the Slugcat. It's also unlikely to be something the Slugcats even evolved from. The exact origins of the Slugcat cannot be exactly traced. All we know is that they may have descended from some unknown purposed organism. The purpose of the Iterators is probably one of the most widely misunderstood pieces of lore in the community. I figured we could take a look at 3 pieces of dialogue from 3 different characters that actually quite concisely explain why the Iterators were originally built. When we first meet Five Pebbles, he explains how his kind, the Iterators, were tasked with solving the oscillating claustrophobia inside of us and countless others. That they are a strange charity or gift, we being the unknowing recipient. Looks to the Moon states that their purpose as an Iterator was a great gift to the lesser beings of the world, that they were supposed to help everyone and everything. The unnamed benefactor describes them as gifts of charity to the world, elaborating that they are gifts for the things that cannot reach enlightenment on their own. Some examples being rocks, gas, bugs, and microbes, the lesser beings. They also go on to describe how they are dependent on Five Pebbles for vital resources, such as water, nectar, energy, void fluid, and so on. Living on the surface was deemed too dangerous, so they had to rely on the Iterators for survival and to fulfill their needs. So, from these 3 pieces of dialogue, we can reasonably conclude that the Iterators were originally built with 2 purposes in mind. Number 1, they were built as a gift to the world, to find a way to transcend everything that cannot reach enlightenment. This includes all of the flora, fauna, bugs, microbes, rocks, gas, and so on, the lesser beings. It was called the Big Problem because it was a global concern. They essentially had to find a way to ascend the entire planet. This is why it was so difficult. And number 2, they were built to provide for their creators, for their survival and convenience. They relied on the Iterators for resources, and for shelter from the rain. Of course, this point sort of becomes irrelevant by the Slugcats' time, since their creators have long since departed. Solving the big problem eventually turned into their sole purpose. Notice how echoes are never even mentioned as being a part of their original purpose. This is because Iterators were never actually built in response to echoes. They were never tasked with finding a way to circumvent or prevent them. The echoes are only ever described as being horror stories. They were more like myths, and it is heavily implied that most individuals weren't even aware of their existence. They were ghosts. 4 needles on their plantful leaves certainly questions whether his peers knew what happened to him. The few who were aware of echoes reverted to the more traditional path towards enlightenment. Some would starve and drink the bitter tea, but there isn't anything to suggest that it was some widespread concern. As a matter of fact, quite the opposite is implied. Keep in mind that, in vanilla, we explore regions that were presumably heavily populated, but only ever encounter a mere 6 echoes. It was a rare occurrence, and few would have known that they existed. Void fluid was generally seen as a perfectly acceptable and even preferred method of personal ascension, since the process was effortless. You didn't have to shed any urges. Ask yourself if they saw issues or were scared of using void fluid and want an alternative. Why does the unnamed benefactor describe how they were blessed with an ever-shrinking population? Why did the final public ascension take place if echoes were still a possibility? The benefactors wanted the Iterators to find a solution that could be applied to the entire world. It was never really about personal ascension or finding an alternative to void fluid. Our journey seems to conclude with our plunge into the void, entering a point of no return and ascending. There is little in the game that prepares you for the void sea, or explains what lies beyond. It is probably for this reason that Ascension often gets compared to death, or rather, non-existence. That leaving the world behind is a sort of final death, or oblivion. Ascension certainly has many parallels to death. For example, we are seen swimming toward a light. We appear ghost-like, and it is the end of the game. But again, on closer inspection, it's not that simple. Ascension is an incredibly nuanced topic, and it may not be all that comparable to death, or at least a complete cessation of life. It is probably best to approach this from the perspective of the ancients or benefactors. A bell, 18 amber beads, describes it as the boundless infinites of the cosmic void. The light blue outskirts pearl describes Ascension as being something above and beyond both life and death. It is said that the process of dissolving or ascending something through void fluid causes it to leave the physical world behind. Looks to the Moon describes how the karma flower became the symbol of enlightenment because it allowed anyone to let go of their carnal self and contact the selves of other planes, dreams, memories, and imagined worlds. All these pieces of dialogue imply that the benefactors sought Ascension not necessarily to cease existence, but more as an escape from the physical world and cycle, and into something above and beyond it. Other planes of existence, if you will. It is probably most akin to something like Nirvana, whereby escaping the material world, they are free from their suffering. This is why the karma flower was treated with such reverence, and came to represent the highest karma symbol, the iconic X. Its influence symbolically represented the overarching goal that Ascension was ultimately meant to achieve. Letting go of your physical self and becoming more spiritually connected to the mind. The benefactors were not some sort of unified death cult, hell-bent on permanently ceasing their existence. In fact, many pieces of dialogue imply that they had many differing opinions and debated each other, especially concerning the nature of the cycle. A lot of people seem to forget that, while they were generally spiritual, they were still a very nuanced society, much like us. 17 axes, 15-spoked wheel seemed to live a fulfilled life, their memories and qualia becoming cherished. They chose to leave the carnal plane behind, not because they hated being alive, but simply because it was seen as the next step in life. In general, they were a spiritual civilization that sought to transition from the physical plane of existence to a more effortless, spiritual one. Some felt bound or claustrophobic in their flesh prisons, as transcending offered a higher plane of existence that was above and beyond life and death. They sought enlightenment, not oblivion. Everything points to it being something beyond just non-existence. The infamous triple affirmative. Affirmative that a solution has been found. Affirmative that the solution is portable. And affirmative that technical implementation is possible and generally applicable. Saint's campaign is very ambiguous, unique, and open to interpretation, but one of the most popular and generally accepted ideas or theories regarding Saint is that they fit the criteria for being a triple affirmative almost perfectly, that they are the simple solution all the Iterators had tried for centuries to find. Saint eventually gains the ability to ascend any creature they want. They gain the ability to take flight. It is heavily implied that they become some sort of echo. And most crucially, they have connections to Sliver of Straw through Challenge 70. Most of these details, in some way or another, feed into different subsets of theories on how Saint is a triple affirmative. But in general, it usually goes something like this. Saint was manufactured or discovered by Sliver of Straw, and she subsequently broadcast her triple affirmative before being ascended by Saint. Saint then went on to ascend other Iterators as time went on, kept alive by their echo abilities, until finally, we experienced their campaign much later down the timeline. However, no matter the theory on how Saint is a triple affirmative, I believe all of them fail in one or two different ways. Firstly, let's focus on Challenge 70, the secret boss fight where Saint is tasked with ascending Sliver of Straw. It is probably what sparked many of these theories in the first place. But is it actually canon? That is, does it depict any real events? Again, if you want to consider external sources, there is some conflicting information out there. Developers who worked on Downpour seem to have different opinions on Challenge 70. Is it not canon? Or is it not canon? Well, Andrew FM, the project lead for Downpour, and the one who probably worked on Challenge 70 the most, stated in its early development that challenges are not canon. So at the very least, Challenge 70 wasn't originally intended to be canon. In any case, Challenge 70 is just so disconnected from any of the campaigns that everything points to it being not canon. For example, it was created with the intention of being a reference to Touhou, since Andrew is a big fan of the game. Some of the patterns are copied directly from it. Challenge 70 is in a completely separate game mode. There is a huge timeline discrepancy, as Sliver of Straw was long gone by even Spearmaster's time. If Saint were to actually fight a fully functional Iterator, what would stop the Iterator from simply instantly killing them? The point is, there are just way too many inconsistent and external variables to reasonably consider Challenge 70 as depicting any real events. It is highly unlikely that Saint has any real connection to Sliver of Straw. But could Saint still be considered a triple affirmative, even if we treated Sliver of Straw or Challenge 70 as irrelevant to our theory? Well, let's carefully consider the definition of a triple affirmative. Simply put, it is affirmative that a solution is found, portable, and can be implemented. However, these three criteria are quite vague and are missing some much needed context. Recall one of the purposes of the Iterators that we discussed earlier, that one of their goals was to find a global solution to ascend the entire planet. All of the flora, fauna, bugs, microbes, rocks, gas, and so on. It is crucial that we keep this in mind for the triple affirmative, as global ascension was its ultimate goal. Now, let's see if we can apply Saint to each criterion with this context in consideration. Number 1. Affirmative that a solution has been found. Sure, I think Saint's ascension can be considered valid. There's no issue here. Number 2. Affirmative that the solution is portable. This point is certainly debatable and depends on your interpretation of portable. Sure, Saint can walk and even fly, but just keep in mind that the areas we explore aren't relatively far. Realistically, I think Saint is much more likely to freeze to death than reach another distant Iterator. Not very portable to me. And this isn't even considering Saint's portability on a global scale. Nonetheless, I'll still consider this point to be debatable and not invalid. Finally, number 3. Affirmative that technical implementation is possible and generally applicable. This is probably the most important and misinterpreted piece of the triple affirmative, as again, the context of global ascension must be considered. It's better to think of it as affirmative that technical implementation is possible and generally applicable to the entire world. It is when we consider it in this context that Saint, without doubt, fails the criteria to be a triple affirmative. In order for this third point to be valid, Saint will have to have the ability to ascend the entire planet, not necessarily just the things that are alive. The rocks, gas, and microbes are as important as the sentient beings when it comes to global ascension. And unfortunately, there is just no feasible way that Saint could ascend everything. For instance, they are restricted to ascending creatures one by one, which greatly limits their scope. Any sort of bacterial growth, or just general reproduction, would certainly overwhelm Saint's ascension, their births outpacing Saint's ability. Furthermore, this issue ignores the fact that Saint can't even ascend many living beings to begin with, let alone physical matter. In a game where even respawning is considered in its canon, I do not think it is fair to dismiss Saint's restrictive ability as a gameplay limitation. In order for them to fulfill this third point, they would have to ascend the entire planet in one single event. Saint just cannot be reasonably applied to the entire world, and may not even count as portable. At most, they're a double affirmative. Unfortunately, this world's big problem cannot be solved by the equivalent of a rat. If anything, I hope this video demonstrated the incredible amount of nuance there is behind rainworld's lore. There's rarely one simple answer. In the poll, I also asked every respondent to rate how well they think they understand rainworld lore, on a scale of 1 to 10. When compared to the actual amount of questions answered correctly, I think it shows how we generally overestimate how much we actually know about a certain topic. Despite investing a significant fraction of my free time for the past 2 years exploring the depths of rainworld's lore, it still feels like I learn something new every day. I absolutely learned a lot from making my error-ridden Ancients video. And despite my best efforts, I'm sure errors will be found in my timeline video too, as the community's lore perception changes. All in all, I would just keep in mind that there's always something new to learn with rainworld's lore. There are half a dozen more common misconceptions that couldn't fit into this video. I just tried to focus on the worst offenders. Remember, the game itself will always remain the best source for information.